One beautiful girl with very red hair had always been a slave and thought that miracles could never happen in her life again. However, this was not true because after the end of the war, her life changed dramatically 20 years ago. The human race received the first heavenly crystal. It symbolized the beginning of the time of magic. Legend has it that the crystals were fragments of power that were scattered across the continent after a battle between deities and demons. And the person who could absorb them and rule by their power could have absolutely everything in that world. Therefore, in the fight for these powerful crystals, wars between clans and empires never stopped. Everyone wanted to get this thing. The empire, which was called Coolness, was located in the west of the continent. Its king was dissolute and trusted by religious officers. The aristocrats in that place, in turn, exploited the farmers and sold slaves to gain wealth and profit for themselves. And the fight for the crystals was the beginning of the war against the Dilexia Empire, because everyone wanted to get their hands on this tasty morsel. This war lasted about 10 years. The border between the two countries was constantly in conflict. Everything around was burning. People were suffering and dying. Nothing alive was left on the borders. And finally, under the leadership of the so-called Dilexian monster, the capital of the Cool Empire fell, and the tyrannical king was killed by this warrior. And in order to survive, the aristocrats brought tribute to this monster of Dilexia in order to calm him down, and so that he would not touch them. Among them, there was also the family of the beautiful girl. It was the Tolly family. Duke Toll was once the king's adversary, only he knew where the hidden crystals were, and it was a thought that he traded for his survival. Their eldest daughter was shocked because her father had married her to the prince of their enemy empire, and of course she didn't like it. Her personal maid said about the girl that her father had reached an agreement with the prince, so she simply had no choice. She also said that he needed the girl to earn his blessing before he could carry out his plan. The woman was incredibly angry at that moment. She didn't even know what to do, because she definitely didn't want to marry him. Then, she suddenly turned her gaze to one girl with red hair who was cleaning her room and immediately remembered that this was the slave that her brother had sent her. So she immediately turned to the girl and told her to immediately turn around and look at her. The girl immediately looked at her mistress and asked if she had any instructions, because she had to do next. The head of Toli's daughter immediately noticed that this girl looked certainly very dirty, but she was also attractive. She quickly approached the slave, and taking her hand, loudly screamed that in that case, it should have been her. The girl immediately began to resist. She said that she could not do anything. She was very afraid and did not understand at all what was required of her. However, her owner immediately looked at her and asked in a surprised voice if she was really afraid of her. But the girl didn't care about her reputation. She simply told the slave that she would have killed her that day if she hadn't gone instead of her. She explained to the poor guy that she just needed her to serve one guy, and asked the developed girl that she did not want to see the whole world that was located outside the palace. At that moment, the girl with red hair seriously thought that this could be her perfect chance to escape from the terrible cage. This slave's name was Vera, and when she was about 10 years old, the Duke sold her into slavery. She could not remember whether she had any family or where her hometown was. She never even knew what beauty was in this place. The royal family members forced her to work, beat her, and insulted her. Other slaves who also worked on that estate constantly took food from Vera, and the girl's only and greatest desire was to leave that place and free herself from the life she had. After the aristocrat ordered her to be prepared for this meeting, the girl wondered whether she would have been executed if she had been exposed. She also thought all the time about what would happen if the prince hit her and insulted her. Like the people who were in this palace, she didn't even know how she should behave. But despite all her fears and concerns, she was aware of the fact that this was a very good chance for her. After some time, when Vera was dressed in a beautiful dress, washed thoroughly, and had her hair done, the woman who was watching all this said that she looked beautiful. After this, she turned to the maid and asked them to take her to the right place, and not let her father even notice that something was wrong. At that very time, in one of the taverns, a beautiful girl with gray hair was sitting. Her name was Rida. She was a member of the Guard Cavalry. The man said he had seen Miss Stoll when he passed through the lobby and said she was truly beautiful. And the girl replied that the Duke was either one of the dead king's servants Rita did not understand at all why His Highness accepted a lady from this country, since this king was responsible for starting the war against the empire. The man sitting next to him was Derek. He was a captain of the Horse Guards and also a prince of the Lancastrian Empire. The man said that the Duke had either put forward conditions that if His Highness wanted to know where the crystals were, he had to marry his daughter. Derek also said that they needed to get the crystals before anyone learned how to use them. They would be at a huge disadvantage if the people around them learned how to extract energy from them. Then Rita turned to another knight who was with them. His name was Walker, and she asked why he didn't say anything about this. This guy had silver hair. He said he had nothing to say. He had no objections. This man was a member of the Guards cavalry. People kept talking about all this. They were really interested in how this whole issue was ultimately going to end. At that very time, Vera was brought into one of the rooms. A maid came to her and told her to wait in this place. His Highness would come after the political issues were resolved. The girl, of course, did not object. She went to the window and simply waited, thanking the maid for the information. The girl herself mentally tried to calm herself down. She was pleased with the fact that she could stay away from her family after she had completed this mission. At that moment, the door to her room opened. A man entered and in a low voice asked the girl if she was the Duke's eldest daughter. He came closer to her and said that he was fulfilling her father's request, but she had to give him the information he needed. It was a tall, dark-haired man, and as soon as he approached Vera, he immediately asked where the heavenly crystals were, which the Cool Empire had obtained during the war. Vera didn't even turn around. She just stood there and was silent. The man. This began to alarm him. He asked why she didn't answer. What else did they want? At that moment, the girl was incredibly worried. The man meanwhile said that if she did not accept the deal, then she should have just left. He would have dealt with the family either through the usual procedures. The girl thought about what information she had to give, because Miss Toll didn't know anything about it. Vera was also very afraid that she could be tortured to death, because she had already arrived and was not supposed to return, so the girl decided to somehow get out of this situation. She turned to His Highness and immediately asked him to give her some time as she quickly walked closer to him, and they stood opposite each other. As soon as the man saw Vera, his heart suddenly fluttered. He did not expect that she could be very beautiful. Tears appeared in the girl's eyes, and she immediately said in a trembling voice that she could not return. She knew nothing about the crystals, but asked him not to send her back. The Duke, hearing this, was very surprised, and asked how it was that she did not want to go back, and also asked if she really forced him to do this. Vera replied that she had come to this place on orders and therefore could not return. She was ready to beg him, even on her knees, so that he would not send her away. But at that moment, to her great surprise, the man quickly came closer to her. He took the girl in his arms. She was very surprised by this. But after that, he threw her rather roughly onto the bed. Vera did not understand at all what was happening and how she should behave. The Duke, meanwhile, came closer to her. She did not realize what he wanted to do, however. As soon as he rushed straight at her, he immediately began to quickly kiss her on the lips. The girl tried to resist, but it was all useless. The man very quickly began to take off her clothes, and under this beautiful dress, she had a body filled with scars and bruises. Vera really hoped that he wouldn't do this in front of her eyes. Probably not tears, and also memories of how she was beaten appeared in her head. She didn't understand at all why everyone was doing this to her. She hadn't done anything wrong, but as soon as the man started kissing her neck, she screamed loudly and said no. The way her voice sounded scared the man very much. He immediately moved away from her and looked the girl straight in the eyes. Vera, meanwhile, continued to cry. She asked in a trembling voice that he not do this again. She had no idea that he wanted this, but she begged him not to do it again. And as soon as the Duke heard this phrase, he became very wary. He could not understand what she meant when she said that they were doing this to her again. Vera immediately began to cover her body with her hands. She loudly asked him for forgiveness, and also said that she did not know that it was necessary. She continued to ask him for forgiveness, and said that she should have done it anyway. The Duke looked at her in surprise for a while, after which he noticed the girl's hand, which was covered in scratches. This shocked him. He realized that the girl had been abused very badly, because she had visible injuries. so he decided not to traumatize her anymore. He took the blanket and immediately threw it over Vera's shoulders, after which, in a quiet voice, he asked her forgiveness for what had happened. He immediately replied that he did not want her to feel uncomfortable at all, and also promised that he would not hurt her again, so he told her to get a good rest. Vera, hearing this, was shocked. She could not believe that this was really happening, and he was not going to hurt her anymore. To confirm his words, the man got out of bed. He told her to stay if she really needed it, and if she wanted it. The man simply stood up and started to leave the room, and Vera sat on the bed and still could not understand what had happened. When the door closed, she breathed a sigh of relief. There were still tears in her eyes, but she did not understand whether she had been able to defend her boundaries, and he really did not insist. Immediately after this, the man went to the roof of his castle, where a blond man stood near the edge. As soon as he heard footsteps behind him, he immediately asked the Duke if they had already finished, and also said that it was quick. The guy, coming closer to him, asked if he really needed to talk about this at all. He didn't understand why he was even raising this topic. But the fair-haired guy then handed him some papers and said that they were from the Dalexi Palace. He also said that the queen wanted to marry him to a girl from her family. His Majesty did not agree, and then he asked the Duke what his opinion was on this matter. He immediately told the guy to reject her. Then the man continued to insist on his own and asked what the reason was, because he needed to indicate it. The Duke did not respond to this. Then his assistant immediately decided to change the subject and asked what was going on about the escape with a mistake. He proposed to marry Miss Toll, and this could have been a really convincing reason for that girl to refuse. Of course, the Duke didn't like this. He didn't understand at all how this could be perceived as a solution to their problem. But his assistant explained that the daughter of a nobleman could not pose any threat on the other hand, although this might not be the case if she worked for the queen. He explained that, in any case, the Duke would have to sacrifice himself for their country. The choice was his alone, and no one had the right to pressure his decision. Several hours had passed since then, and morning had already arrived outside the window. The maid knocked on Vera's door and asked if she had woken up yet. As soon as the girl heard so much Tver, she immediately opened her eyes. In fact, for the first time in a long time, she was able to get enough sleep, even despite what happened the previous day. I wish the maid came into the room and, smiling, wished her good morning. She said that His Highness asked to convey that he would take her for a walk and asked to help her change clothes. The maid came closer to Vera and said that she now served both her and the prince, and she could simply call her a Rose. The woman had special clothes in her hands, which she was supposed to help clothe Faith in, and asked that Ta simply agree to help. The girl Sev immediately thanked her on the bed, after which she began to take off her nightgown, and the maid saw many scars and cuts on her back. Rose immediately asked in a surprised voice what all this was about. Of course, she could not even imagine that the prince could be so wild. After this, sighing heavily, she said that, of course, young people could be so creative and in the heat of passion and not even control themselves. Vera heard this and was immediately indignant. She said that it was not him at all. She already wanted to explain, but the maid did not let her say anything. Rose smiled and said that she didn't need to be embarrassed. The young people were energetic and creative. She understood everything. After that, the maid helped her get dressed. It was an incredibly beautiful mint-colored outfit, but Vera, when she looked at herself, immediately said that she did not deserve such an expensive dress. It was too extravagant. Well, the maid didn't understand how she could even say such a thing, because it suited the girl perfectly. At that moment, the Duke knocked on the door of the room. He turned to Rose and asked if the girl was ready yet. The maid immediately said that everything was ready, so he could come in. Then the man, who was also dressed up, opened the door and went inside. Rose smiled happily and turned to the Duke and asked if it was true that Miss Vera looked simply wonderful in this new dress. The man really thought so, but because he was so embarrassed that his cheeks turned red, he turned away and said that now that the girl was ready, they could go. Vera then quickly approached him as he began to leave. She took him by the sleeve and asked if she could find out where they were going. Then the man, moving forward, said that they were going to church, and after some time, they really found themselves in front of the door to the church. Vera did not understand at all why he suddenly brought her to this place, so she decided to ask him directly. The girl looked at the man and asked what they were doing there. The man was surprised by her question and immediately replied that they had to take an oath in honor of their marriage. As soon as the girl heard this, she was sincerely amazed. In a trembling voice, she said that he shouldn't have done that last night, that she had made a mistake and shouldn't have done that to him. Then the man said that if she wanted to separate from Tolya's family, she had to become his wife. He needed a reason to reject another marriage. The only solution was to marry her. This marriage would benefit both of them. He also told her not to worry, because he would take care of her daily life, and he was not going to do anything rough to her like what happened last night. He looked the girl straight in the eyes and said that he was really sorry that this happened, and he asked me to forgive him for it. Vera couldn't believe that he actually apologized to her. This had never happened to her before, so she said that everything was fine. Nothing like that happened, so he shouldn't apologize. Then the Duke said that he could marry her, and if their marriage would help her, then in that case he was ready to consider it as her consent. After that, he went ahead and told Vera not to lag behind. It was time for them to start, in order to just finish this as soon as possible. As soon as they entered, the priest turned to Brian D'Alexi and asked if he was ready to marry Vera and stay with her and love her forever until death do them part. The man immediately said that of course he was ready. Then the priest repeated the same phrase, but this time addressing Vera, and the girl in a reflective voice said that she was also ready. Of course, she was incredibly worried and nervous, but she understood that this was the best option for her, so she just had to take the risk. After the vows were ready, the priest asked them to exchange their symbols of love and kiss each other in order to confirm the legitimacy of their relationship. At that moment, Brian immediately took off his ring and said that he wanted to use this thing as a sign. At that moment, Vera was very worried. She immediately said that she had not prepared anything and asked him what she was supposed to do. She also asked him for forgiveness. He said that he was completely unaware of such an important detail. But the man replied that everything was fine. It was just a formality, so she shouldn't worry about doing anything wrong. The priest approached them and said that she could give him this badge after the wedding. All they had to do was kiss each other to bind their relationship before the deity, and everything else could be done later. Then the guy and the girl immediately turned to each other. Of course, Vera was very worried and nervous, but Brian still leaned down to her lower, and they kissed on the lips. It was a very awkward kiss. However, the girl was even a little embarrassed, because as soon as his lips touched hers, she felt some interesting feeling inside herself. And as they kissed, the priest said that they had completed their vows to each other, and in the name of the deities, he declared them a couple forever. Immediately after this ceremony, Brian walked forward, and Vera walked behind him, and was still thinking about this kiss that happened. As soon as the man approached the carriage, he glanced at her and immediately asked what had happened, whether she felt unwell. But the girl who caught up with him as quickly as possible immediately said that this was not so. Everything was fine with her, and he should not worry. But Brian continued to insist on his own. He said that her face was all red and asked if she had a fever. Then he touched her forehead to check her temperature. But her forehead was completely cold. He said that her temperature was normal, so he became even more wary. As soon as Brian removed his hand from her, Vera took a step back in order to keep her distance. The man noticed this and immediately asked if she was afraid of him. The girl quickly shook her head and said that it was not like that at all. She was simply not used to all this. No one had ever worried about her before, and so it was something new for her. Then she looked down and began to tug at her hands. Her hands were even shaking, and the man immediately noticed this and realized that she felt uncomfortable and was very worried. So Brian suggested that they just go back to the palace first. He was going to heal her injuries and only then talk. They got into the carriage and started to drive away. As soon as they passed one of the cities, Vera looked out the window and immediately wondered if this was really the same world outside the mansion. She saw unhappy people on the streets who lived there, and she thought that perhaps they were also slaves and were very hungry. Brian, meanwhile, sat opposite her and noticed that her expression suddenly became very sad. So he asked what happened. The girl sighed heavily and said that all these people looked incredibly pitiful to her. It seemed that they were too hungry, and for this reason were unhappy. The man, hearing this, immediately understood everything and said that it was all about the war, after which there was an awkward silence between them, each thinking about what they had seen and heard. Then Vera realized that she had explained her thought incorrectly, and immediately said that this was not what she meant. But the man interrupted her and said that everything was fine. They were victims of the war between their empires, and he was responsible for it as well. At that very time, in the mansion, Toli's father found out about his daughter's plan and hit her on the cheek so hard that she even fell to the ground. He yelled at the girl and said that she was completely useless. She ruined his plan, and for this reason, she got hit in the face. He yelled at his daughter and said that he just wanted her to hold off the prince so that they could survive until reinforcements arrived. However, in the end, his daughter simply went and set him up. The girl immediately started screaming back. She said that she would rather die than marry a prince from a demonic family, which is why she came up with this plan, because no one listened to her. Then the girl's mother approached her husband and asked what he thought about writing a letter to the Princess of Porthi and asking her for help. She explained that they would not be able to leave the capital in time because they were helping her transport the crystals, and that was the reason she had to help them. No one had time to say anything else, because a maid ran into the room. She turned to His Highness and said that she had some news that the prince had taken the slave to church. The woman also said that perhaps they had made vows to each other and were now officially husband and wife. As soon as the guy and the girl heard this, they were shocked. The wife looked at her husband and said that this could not be fixed. When the monster gave everything, he will find out the truth. They will begin to torture them. She was truly incredibly scared about this. But the man knew that they couldn't leave the city, and even if they kept Alex's soldiers and their servants, it still wouldn't give them much. He knew that they had to hold out as long as possible to get help from the park princess. It was his only hope, and that was the reason he decided to wait. At that very time, Brian and Vera came to the magic tower, where a little girl was preparing a very exciting potion. She was so engrossed in the process that she didn't even notice the guests. But the man made a loud noise on purpose so that she would finally pay attention to them. The girl immediately turned around, and when she saw Brian, she was very happy. Her eyes literally shone with happiness because she truly loved this man with all her soul. However, when she looked to the side and saw a girl next to him, she was very surprised and asked who she was. Brian said that it was his wife, Vera Toll. She was the Duke's daughter. The girl immediately stepped forward and greeted this sorceress with a trembling voice. As soon as she heard this, she was really very shocked. She turned away from the man and told Brian that she had already been with him, so she did not understand why he decided to marry another. It was really very painful for her that he did this. The man felt very awkward about all this. But then suddenly, the sorceress picked up one of the potions and asked if they had any instructions for her, because they didn't just come for no reason. Then Brian said that he needed a potion that could heal the scars from the tourniquet. As soon as the sorceress heard this, she was shocked again and immediately thought about the fact that perhaps this Vera beat the man with a whip in her preoccupied games. She turned her gaze to the girl and thought that she could not believe that the man actually allowed such a vicious woman to be near him under her clean face. In fact, the woman believed that there was a dirty heart there, and therefore, she was definitely not suitable for Brian. Vera, at that moment, even became a little worried. She did not understand why this child was looking at her like that, but her face was so round, and her ears were a very interesting shape. She really had a very cute appearance, so soon the girl could not resist and smiled as soon as she looked at this sorceress. And as soon as the sorceress saw this smile, she immediately thought that despite the fact that the girl seemed very aggressive to her at first, she smiled sweetly. So she handed Brian the ointment and said that it was a special powder that she made so that the scars would heal after this substance was applied to them. But she also asked them not to forget to say the spell. The spell was called Kiss, and the pain will go away. Soon the sorceress handed over this substance, and Brian turned around and started to leave. He also told the girl to return to what she was doing. They would not bother her anymore. When they started to leave, the sorceress also asked Brian not to forget to visit her. It was incredibly painful for her to learn this news, and therefore she cried for a long time after they left. Meanwhile, they had already returned back to the estate, and Vera changed into a nightgown so that all her injuries could be properly treated. At that very time, Brian stood behind the door and asked if she had already changed her clothes. The girl then slowly opened the door and turned to His Highness. He immediately looked at her with a worried look and asked what was wrong, because he heard notes of alarm in her voice. But Vera quietly asked if he could do her a favor. She came out to him and said that the dress was too tight and she wanted him to unbutton it from behind because she simply couldn't reach it. As soon as the man heard this, he immediately became embarrassed. But he came closer to her and said that in addition to the zipper, she also had a knot on her corset. It was quite dense, so it took some effort. Vera immediately asked him for forgiveness for causing him so much inconvenience, but the man could not untie it in any way. I do not understand why Rosa tied it so tightly. At that very time, the knights were passing by that room, and Derek was walking in front of them all. He said that all the captains were given special tasks, also that His Highness gave the order that they should clear the remains in the surrounding area as soon as possible. But then suddenly, one of the knights turned to him and said that they would complete the mission as quickly as possible, in which case they would have to give the prince to him. But as they passed the door where Brian continued to try to untie the knot, they heard their conversation where the girl asked him to be more gentle, and the man replied that he only tightened it even more. This made them all feel very awkward, and Derek immediately turned to the knights and said that it was almost lunchtime, so they had better go to the dining room. And after some time, Brian finally managed to untie the girl's dress. She immediately thanked him for it and lowered it a little lower so that all the scratches and wounds could be seen. The man, meanwhile, moved away from her so as not to embarrass her, and saw how Vera tried to apply powder to the wounds with this brush and how difficult it was for her. He then came closer to her and said that if she didn't mind, he could apply the powder to her back and let her treat the wounds on her chest herself, since it was quite difficult for her to reach her back. The girl did not object. Then the man began his business and said that this powder was effective, but could cause irritation, and asked how she felt in general. Vera immediately said that everything was fine with her. The wounds were small, so there certainly shouldn't have been such a strong effect. Brian replied that my father was very ruthless. He spanked her like a slave, and this of course surprised him very much. But as soon as the girl heard this, tears immediately came to her eyes, because she was very scared. Since he mentioned the slave in all this, she even assumed that he could suspect her of something. So she decided to answer him by saying that her father was strict with her and believed that she would not learn if she was not punished, which is why he treated her that way. The man immediately said that he understood this, and after that, the girl suddenly turned to him and asked if he would have kicked her out if she had done something wrong, because she should have known. Brian, hearing this, was very surprised and said that he actually had no intention of doing anything like that, and asked why she even had such thoughts. Vera then turned away from him again and asked what people who made mistakes were called. She was interested. The man sighed heavily and said that, according to the laws of his country, they were called offenders. But if the girl did nothing like that, then everything would be fine with her. Then Vera thought about the fact that if she could find a compromise, then perhaps everything would be, and even be good. So she thought about the fact that she would have to think carefully about this. And when some time had passed since then, they had finished treating the back, and the maids came into the girl's room. Rose walked ahead of them all. She turned to His Highness and said that, by his order, she had brought the maids and the tailor. The man allowed them to enter. Then a young guy entered the room. He said that his name was Andrew, and he was happy to serve them along with his assistants. Brian said in the meantime that he would go, and if she needed anything, she could just call Rose. The girl, of course, felt very uncomfortable about this. However, she said that she understood everything. After this, he turned to the maid and said that he was leaving the girl with her. The woman immediately smiled and said that she would take care of the faith and that something was in safe hands. After he left the room, she turned to the girl and suggested that he first measure her dimensions so that later the dress could be made properly. The girl did not object and said that she would not mind, and also thanked the maid for this. As they began to take her measurements, she thought that this was all very strange. For the first time, she was surrounded by so many people who wanted the best for her. While Rosa was measuring the sizes, she immediately spoke to the maids about it. They discussed various points among themselves and were quite friendly. When Vera heard all this, she thought that not only did all these people not mock her, but they even behaved very welcomingly and friendly. They were very polite towards her, and this surprised her. She even wondered if their relationship towards her would change if they found out that she was an imposter. At that moment, one of the maids, when she was making the mark and pinning the skirt, immediately panicked because she could have hurt Vera a little, and she asked her for forgiveness if she had hurt her. But the girl immediately said that it was all wrong, everything was fine, and she shouldn't worry so much about the fact that something could go wrong. Some time passed since then, and Vera was finally able to sit down and rest a little. She was very glad that it was all finally over, and she could sit down, because this day had been very long, and she had been on her feet the whole time. Then Rose suddenly noticed that it was already quite late. She told me that she would cook dinner for her, because she was probably already very hungry. And when some time had passed since then, Rose went to the girl. One of the maids came up to her and told Miss that the hot water was already ready, so she could go and take a bath. Vera was very panicked that they were going to help her with this matter, and immediately said that she could have done it on her own. They didn't need to do it with her at all. Yes, the maid smiled happily and said that it was quite normal. She would just watch in the meantime how the preparations for dinner were going, and also said that the girl should feel at home and not worry. After this, she and the other maids went out the door, and Vera was left alone. In fact, the girl felt very uncomfortable because she was not at all used to the fact that she could be served. She preferred to do it herself. And for this reason, the girl could not relax at all. As soon as she came to the bathroom and took off her clothes, she looked at herself in the mirror and saw a lot of different scars all over her body. Previously, this did not bother her at all, but she decided that she should keep these scratches a secret from all other people, because it was believed that they could misunderstand all this and perhaps even scold her. However, fortunately, the prince did not doubt her because of all these injuries, so Vera did not worry too much. He just accepted it as a fact and decided to help her fight. When the girl climbed into the hot bath, she immediately felt good because the water was very warm, and at that moment the girl felt so fresh. She thought about how the life of noble women was really very wonderful. She had a lot of food and a warm place to live, and kind people around her. Of course, Vera had never had all of this before, and so this life was simply unimaginable for her. Because of this, she even began to envy all the noble ladies who had this on a permanent basis. For her, it was a real blessing to live such a life. Even if only for a few days, for a fairly long period of time, Vera sat in the bathroom and thought about various things. But soon, the door to her room opened and a maid came in. She said that almost time had passed and bathing for too long was against their rules. It was a young maid whom the girl had not seen before, and as soon as she entered the room, the atmosphere immediately became tense, which made Vera feel uncomfortable. The girl immediately took a towel and began to cover her body with it so that the maid would not see anything. She said that she understood everything, and also that she could leave because she could get dressed on her own. However, the maid came up to her very quickly and grabbed her by the hair, starting to pull her out of the bathroom. This action was very rude, sharp, and unpleasant. Then the maid said in a cold voice that the girl had just been a fake lady for one day, but for some reason, she had already decided that she could command them. Vera immediately looked at this girl and asked who she was, because she had never met her before, and such behavior was simply outrageous. The maid then moved closer to her and said that she had come to help her and control her by order of the Duke himself, so now they had to be constantly nearby. Of course, Vera, hearing this, was very surprised. She thought for some time about what to do, after which she pushed the maid aside and said that she did not need her help and asked her to leave. But the maid, of course, remained in place. She said that the Duke hoped that the girl would be able to do everything possible to seduce the prince. So she suggested that Vera take some time to think before taking any action on her part. Yes, the girl told the truth. She replied that she could no longer lie to anyone. She had to stop doing such bad things because she didn't like it. But the maid continued to insist on her own. She said that the Duke had hidden her identity as a slave, and this meant that the girl had to answer him in kind, and asked if it was true that Vera did not want to upset the Dalek monster with her true identity. After all, no one knew what he was capable of. She also said that posing as a nobleman was a criminal offense, especially if Vera was a slave. She didn't answer this. She couldn't understand why they couldn't just let her go. Miss either promised her this, but in the end, everything turned out differently. She no longer had to do anything for the Duke, but she did not understand why they asked her back, so Vera simply asked what she thought she needed to do. As soon as the maid heard this, she immediately smirked and said that it was already a little better. At that very time, Brian was in his office. Next to him were also the knights. They asked him what he thought they should do with the nobles remaining in the capital. One of the knights believed that they should have executed them just as they did with the kingdom of Cool. But the other guy said that of course they couldn't do that. These nobles were connected to the heads of other empires, and if they just killed them, they would only have more problems that would have to be solved immediately. The guy also said that the war had been going on for many years, and they could not afford a conflict with other empires. However, the knight objected to him. He said that they had never lost a single battle, so they should conquer all the resisting empire. That would be much better for them. Brian, meanwhile, just sat in his place and listened to all this. The other knights also offered their options and made comments about these proposals. But the man did not answer anything. He kept his opinion to himself. And at that very time, behind the wall stood one of the head knights. He thought that these guys were very reckless, and that was the reason they were saying completely idiotic ideas. He was not going to interfere in their argument, and then suddenly he heard someone approaching him. The guy immediately raised his head to see who it was. Vera found herself directly with this person. She introduced herself and said that she had come to this place in order to find and talk to Prince Brian. By that time, the girl had already finished taking a shower and dressed in special clothes that were custom made for her. The man then sighed heavily and said that the prince was in a meeting now, and so she needed to wait a while until he was free. Vera immediately thanked him and called him Highness, but Derek said that she could just call him by his first name. There was no need for all these formalities. He did not really like them. As soon as she heard this, she was a little surprised, because usually people with his status asked for more polite forms. But the guy was not like that. Derek himself knew perfectly well that he was a prince from the empire of the Rands, and therefore he did not need to be reminded of this every time I addressed him politely. He was quite satisfied with simply communicating by name. Then Vera suddenly asked why the man himself was not at that meeting, since it was probably quite important. The guy explained that his country had sent him to this place as a hostage, and the king of Delexia had ordered him to never interfere in any internal affairs. But at that moment, the doors suddenly opened, and people began to come out, little by little. Derek immediately smiled and said that the meeting was over, so she could go now. When Vera looked at all these very stern people, she immediately assumed that things had not gone very smoothly there, and because of this, she felt a little uncomfortable. Well, Derek at that moment smiled and said that the generals had been fighting for so long that they saw all the other people around them as their enemies. So he said that the girls shouldn't pay attention to those stern looks. Immediately, after all the other knights, Brian also came out of the room, and when he saw the girl, he was very surprised and asked what she was doing there, because he definitely didn't expect to see her. The girl, as soon as she saw him, immediately became embarrassed and lowered her head, because the man in this beautiful form looked simply amazing. However, after that, she asked in a trembling voice if she could invite him to dinner with her that day. Brian was genuinely surprised by this proposal, but said that of course he would agree to it. Derek, who was standing between them, suddenly smiled and said that it was supposed to be a candlelit dinner, and that he was very jealous of them because he had not had such a romantic atmosphere for a long time. Several hours passed since then. The maids finally prepared the required dinner, and the man and the girl went downstairs. Brian sat down in his usual place, and Vera sat opposite him, but at a completely different end of the table. In order to somehow break their awkward silence, the man asked her if she liked the dishes that the maids had prepared for dinner. The girl immediately said that they were wonderful. Then Brian suddenly asked if Vera was still not used to living in this place, since he constantly saw her embarrassment and trembling voice. He also said that Rose told him that the girl had been sitting in her bedroom almost all the time these days and hadn't come out, so he had to find out for sure. But Vera immediately replied that this was not so at all. She simply did not know the castle well and therefore did not dare to walk around it. After that, Brian asked her if she liked her maid. The girl also said that she was satisfied with everything. They did their job well. After that, she glanced briefly at the very same maid that the Duke had sent, and the girl looked at her with a stern look in response. She was always nearby and always controlled the movement and behavior of Faith. Before this dinner, the woman explained to her that Vera could be the Duke's daughter until the Duke could escape danger. So she had to stick to their theory and not back down under any circumstances. The woman explained to her that this would be a very painted decision, so she would be better off following the rules so that she would not be punished. Of course, Vera herself realized that this made sense, but she did not understand why she should trust people who once caused her a lot of pain. Of course, she doubted what she should do because she didn't want to hurt anyone or die. She just wanted a quiet life and freedom. Brian suddenly noticed that her expression had changed, and he immediately asked what had happened, if she had felt unwell. Vera Zapanikov immediately replied that this was not so, after which she asked His Highness if they could take a walk together sometime. The man was amazed because she jumped from one topic to another so quickly, but wiping his genus after eating, he said that of course there was no problem with that. After that, they finished their food. Brian was the first from the table. He told the maids to clean up everything around them, and there was no need to follow them. The maids immediately said that they understood everything. Then the man came closer to Vera and extended his hand to help her stand up. Meanwhile, it had already gotten a little dark outside. The guy and the girl left the estate and walked in complete silence. No one knew what to say. The situation between them was tense. Vera walked all this time, even with her head down. She was always immersed in thoughts of how exactly she should act and what she should say. The girl controlled herself all the time. Of course, Brian noticed that something was wrong and asked if she had had any problems lately. Vera immediately replied that this was not the case at all. Everything was absolutely fine with her, but she was a little scared, which may have caused suspicion towards herself. Then Brian said that, in fact, she didn't need to force herself to communicate with him. It was not necessary at all. So he said that she always seemed very restless when he was around, and for this reason, he decided to warn her. Vera immediately stopped and said that this was not true at all. She was just a little nervous. Something like this had never happened to her before, so she had to control herself all the time, how to behave and what to say. She also looked the man straight in the eye and said that, in fact, he was the best of all the people she had ever met. Brian was certainly very pleased to hear this, but he wondered if her family had forced her to come to this place and if they had treated her badly. The girl lowered her head and was silent for a while, after which she said that this was not at all true. Her father was quite kind to her. Vera felt very uncomfortable. She didn't like lying to people, but here she had to come up with a new story. But the girl said that she didn't want to go back, only because she didn't want to see her father's disappointed face, because after all, she was a gift that he gave to the man to show his sincerity. Vera explained that she had lived a good life and had everything she wanted. Her family had always been very kind to her, so she asked him not to mention them in any bad way anymore, because it was unpleasant for her to hear it. She also said that she could not remember the past happy moments that she had. But as soon as the girl said this, tears immediately came to her eyes. She was ready to cry there. Brian, seeing this reaction, understood perfectly well that most likely these were not happy memories. She was hiding something, and he knew it. But the man did not want to put pressure on her because he understood that this could not lead to anything good. Then he reached out and wiped away her tears, saying that everything was fine and that he wouldn't mention it again if it really made her uncomfortable. Vera was amazed by his closeness. She felt incredibly pleased. But because of the wind, which was quite strong, the ribbon that was in her hair began to fly away. And now her beautiful, long red hair flew apart. This moment was delightful. Brian looked at her without taking his eyes off, because she was incredibly beautiful at that moment. However, Vera suddenly couldn't hold back and sneezed loudly. She immediately felt very awkward, and she asked him for forgiveness for such rudeness, because she knew that according to the rules of etiquette, this was not allowed. Brian replied that it was okay. The weather was getting quite cold, so it was better for them to separate, so he told her to go to bed. The girl lowered her head down and immediately thought about the fact that that maid was probably already waiting for her, and as soon as she returned, the girl would definitely punish her for everything that she did wrong. For this reason, Vera definitely did not want to return to her room. She took the man by the cloak and told him to let her spend the night with him. It was very important. Brian, hearing this, was amazed. He just looked at her with huge eyes for a while and did not understand whether she was really serious. And only then did Vera think about the fact that she had been too straightforward, and perhaps he had misunderstood her words. The girl already wanted to explain what she meant, but the man did not let her say anything and simply agreed. He was not against her sleeping with him. Of course, Vera was amazed by this. She didn't think that he could agree, she just tried it, just in case. Some time passed from that moment. They went up to the man's bedroom, and he suddenly began to take off his clothes. Vera, seeing this, immediately became embarrassed. She didn't understand what he was doing, and then suddenly Brian looked at her. As soon as she saw his gaze, she became even more embarrassed and immediately tried to pretend as if she hadn't been looking at him all this time. However, the man came closer to her and asked why she was just standing there. Didn't she need to take off her clothes in order to change? The girl screamed loudly and immediately asked why she had to do this. She really believed that he could do something bad to her. But Brian, as if nothing had happened, asked if she really always slept in such a warm and uncomfortable tight dress. The girl was actually very frightened by all this, but now she understood that it was just ordinary politeness and concern, and her thoughts were filled only with vulgarities. Therefore, she soon calmed down and took off her very heavy dress. The man lit a fireplace so that they would be warm, and after that, they lay down in the same bed. There was quite a large distance between them. Brand closed his eyes and tried to fall asleep, and Vera felt even more uncomfortable when she lay next to him. The girl couldn't even fall asleep, so she turned around and glanced at the man, whose breathing had already calmed down, and he was slowly falling asleep. Vera herself wondered why he was not as terrible in reality as they said out loud. On the contrary, she even felt that he was more friendly than everyone else in the Duke's mansion. She suggested that perhaps he treated her kindly because he accepted her as a true noblewoman, and for this reason simply had no right to do anything rude. For a while, Vera lay next to him and watched him sleep, but then suddenly, Brian's eyes opened and he asked what was going on. The girl immediately turned to the other side and answered in a quiet voice that it was the first time she had ever been in the same bed with a man, and therefore she was a little nervous. The guy then calmly replied that it was also his first time lying with a woman. Vera was very surprised to hear this, because she did not think that he was a nobleman and had never had a lady next to him. After this conversation, the man closed his eyes, and Vera turned over to her other side. The man said in a quiet voice that it was already late, so she needed to try to sleep. She agreed with him. Some time passed since then, and Vera was finally able to fall asleep. But Brian, on the contrary, woke up and looked at how she lay calmly and slept next to him, completely defenseless. He suggested that perhaps the girl did not know where the crystals were, because Duke Tali had said that security in the capital had been strengthened so that he and his people could not escape into the city. And so Brian was very interested in what he was planning when he sent his daughter to his estate. Of course, he assumed that it was possible that it was espionage, but he didn't know for sure. And besides, when he thought about Faith, he doubted very much whether she had really lived a happy life before, as she had said. He was curious to know why he felt that she had only fear and pain in her past, and whether she really didn't want to go back because she was afraid of disappointing her father, or because she was afraid that everything that happened could happen again. When she looked at a man, she always looked as if she was afraid of him. Of course, under normal circumstances, Vera should have been crying and begging him to come back, but everything was the opposite, and this surprised Brian even more than anything, so he believed that he had to thoroughly understand this whole situation and find out the truth. With these thoughts, the man closed his eyes and fell asleep. Closer to the morning, the girl had a terrible nightmare. She even screamed in her sleep. Brian woke her up and told her to wake up. The man was already fully dressed. As soon as she opened her eyes, for some time, she did not understand what was happening and where she was. She suddenly pushed him away and told him not to come near her. Vera was very scared. She was even shaking all over. The girl held her hands. She said that she was wrong, was useless, and begged that they not kill her. She whispered all this, and he could hear all these words perfectly. The man was very surprised by this behavior. He understood that he had to somehow calm her down, so he put his hands on her shoulders and said that everything was fine. Brian also replied that absolutely no one should have harmed her. She could calm down and not worry. Vera obeyed him. Her breathing calmed down a little, as did her heartbeat, but fear was still present in her eyes. But the man was also pleased with this result. He said that she was great. She really was a fighter since she was able to calm down even with such a strong panic. At that moment, the girl finally realized what had happened. Her face turned red, and she immediately asked him for forgiveness for being so rude. The man then realized that she was now okay, and he left her alone, telling her to wash up, and then he would take her downstairs for breakfast. Vera immediately agreed. Some time had passed since then. At that very moment, many knights were already sitting in the hall and having breakfast, heatedly discussing some topics. The army commander told Rita and Walker that their job was to resettle the followers outside the city. Derek asked that they also tell him if they had a problem that they couldn't solve because it was important. The man suddenly noticed that Rita looked very sad, and immediately turned to her and asked what had happened, because he was worried about her. But the girl replied that she was fine. At that very moment, Brian walked into the dining room with the girl, and everyone immediately paid attention to him. The man approached his army commander and said that he had gotten up quite late, and that was why he was a little late for breakfast. But the man replied that it was okay, because they were newlyweds, so it was obvious. Brian meanwhile turned to Vera. He introduced Derek to the girl and said that they had already met yesterday. The man immediately turned to Miss Stola and said that he was very glad that they had met again. The girl smiled and greeted him. She was really pleased to see him again. Derek was a very nice young man. Brian meanwhile pointed towards the blonde guy and said something like, "Walker," and then towards the girl and introduced her as Rita. The man also explained that they were both members of the Guard Cavalry, and so they would often cross paths in the future, which was why he introduced them. Vera was a little worried, because she was afraid that she might do or say something wrong, but she greeted them and said that she was very pleased to meet them. However, at that very moment, Rita suddenly stood up from her seat and said that it was time for her to leave, so she had to go. Then Walker also stood up from his place. He said that he too had already eaten, and it was time for him to go. He told His Highness that he was very glad to meet him this morning. As soon as Derek saw this, he was very surprised and immediately told the Duke that he, and then could not believe that these two could take the adherence of coolness so seriously, since they ran to do their business as quickly as possible. The prince meanwhile took his place, and Vera, in fact, was perfectly aware of the fact that they left precisely because of her, and she felt a little uncomfortable. Then the army commander turned to his superior and asked why he suddenly wanted to resettle the parishioners. This surprised him because the man knew that they were from an enemy country and that there could even be rebels among them, which would have a very bad effect on their rule. As soon as Vera heard this, she was amazed and immediately thought about the fact that perhaps he took into account the words she said as soon as they were driving to the estate about the poor residents who were starving on the streets. Of course, it was just hope. However, she decided not to dwell on it too much. At that moment, the man handed her the meat from his plate and told her to be sure to eat it. The girl thanked him for this. Derek then turned to His Highness and said that he, too, would not mind an extra piece of meat. But the man told him not to bother him. They grumbled at each other for a while, but in reality, the girl really hoped that they were on good terms because it was important to have a person who supported and understood. That very evening, the Duke, who was at his estate, was very angry because he was told some important information about the faith, and in principle, the prince. He also received news from the queen, and he was very angry because the girl refused to send troops to save them, which made him incredibly sad. After everything that happened between them after he showed his loyalty, she simply used him and left him and his family to certain death. Other noble families in the city were already bending under the pressure of the Dalek monster and going over to his side, so the man simply had no options left. He didn't even understand how he was able to survive and get out of the city under such pressure. However, then he suddenly thought that not all was lost yet since he had the heavenly crystal, and this was indeed good news for him. However, this was his trump card for a new beginning if he could escape, and if everything went as it should. But he had no guarantees. However, then he suddenly realized that if he suddenly died, then in that case, these stones could become absolutely priceless. So he needed to survive, and he needed exactly that crystal. But he did not know what in that case he could use at all in order to survive. After breakfast, Vera went to her room. She spent quite a long time just standing at the entrance, not knowing whether the maid was waiting for her there. She was a little afraid of what she had to do. However, soon she touched the door handle and heard a voice behind her. This voice said that she had finally returned, and it belonged directly to this very servant who was from the Duke. Of course, Vera knew that she was sitting there and waiting for her, because such people never gave her peace. However, she did not understand what terrible thing she wanted Vera to do this time, because she was already tired of putting up with all this. The maid was sitting at a table and drinking tea. She turned to the girl and said that she had heard that she and the prince had breakfast together that morning, and therefore it seemed to her that he was quite satisfied with her. And this was even good. Vera replied that she had done what the Duke had asked her to do, and asked if she could, in that case, no longer pursue her at every step and just leave her alone. But the maid told her to just calm down and sit down and drink some of their best tea that she had brewed. Vera sat down opposite her and looked at this mug with a very distrustful look. She understood that there could be anything in there, and for this reason she was afraid. The maid, meanwhile, smiling happily, told her to drink a little, and also that the Duke had one more task for her that she had to complete. The woman assured her that if she finished it, no one would force her to do anything else. Of course, upon hearing about this, Vera immediately became interested. However, she could no longer simply believe it and said that she would have to swear to her that this was really the last time. The maid replied that she didn't need to know all the details. She just had to continue to distract the monster, and she had already prepared everything she would need to complete this mission. The girl also said that she should enjoy this wonderful tea, and after that, she would definitely be free. Brian, meanwhile, was in a meeting with some knights. They said that for some time they had been driven to the brink by the reduction of supplies, and the old nobility could not tolerate it any longer. They gave the man some letters about how they were simply giving up, and after that, they asked their highness if they could really trust their loyalty, because this could all turn out to be much more difficult than it seemed. The man replied that they shouldn't worry, and began writing something down on his papers. Brian also asked that they publish their letters of surrender, and when the time came, they would send them back to the Dalixi Empire and allow the king to decide their fate himself. Walter, who came to tell him about all this, said that there was another problem. He thought that there were some problems with the resettlement of the refugees of the cold. Another person also agreed with him and said that it was really problematic, that the forces of coolness had attacked their border and killed so many people, so of course they did not make contact. Also, one of the knights said that they did not harm their civilians, so he believed that they did more than enough. But Brian replied that he understood perfectly well what they meant, and had thought about it too, but they still had to do it because it could prevent future warriors. Of course, many disagreed with him, but no one had time to say anything else, because there was a knock on the door. The man allowed him to enter. Then Vera came into the room and asked him for forgiveness for disturbing him, but said that she had brought him tea and snacks. The man then stood up from his seat and addressed all the knights, and said that this was enough for that day, so they could now go and perform their duties. After the knights left the door, the girl immediately thought about the fact that she had interrupted something really important, because while they were leaving, they looked at the girl with a very condemning look. But she decided not to pay too much attention to it. Then they sat down at the table, and the girl set the table and poured tea for both of them. They were silent for a while. Then Brian asked if she needed anything special at all. Maybe she had any wishes. The girl, hearing this, was a little surprised. She looked at him and immediately said that she had no wishes at all, and never had any. She explained that she simply thought that since they were married, they should spend more time together. She thought it was the right thing to do, and that was the reason she did it. Then, suddenly, Brian asked if it was true that she was trying to help her father. He assured her that she was safe as they had promised each other in church. Nothing bad was going to happen to her anymore. He also said that she didn't have to do it at all, because she was afraid that he might kick her out or do something bad. So the man sincerely asked her to tell him the truth. He believed that he deserved to know it.